What happens when a rap battle turns deadly? What starts as a simple contest of words where artists challenge each other with clever rhymes and sharp punchlines can quickly transform into something far darker. It's easy to forget that beneath the surface of these seemingly harmless competitions lies something much deeper: pride, ego, and a fragile sense of honor. Today, we uncover the shocking story of a woman who survived unimaginable brutality at the hands of three men, all because her victory in a rap battle bruised their egos in the most violent way possible. Dominique Clark, known to her friends as Nikki, was no stranger to rap battles. She had spent years honing her craft, building a reputation in the underground scene as a quick-witted lyricist who could hold her own against anyone. But on one fateful night in Columbus, Georgia, Dominique would face a challenge like never before. As the music thumped and the crowd cheered, she stepped into the circle with her competitors, including Robert Johnson, a man who prided himself on his aggressive rap style and reputation. What began as a simple freestyle battle quickly turned into something much more personal. Dominique's words flowed effortlessly, sharp and precise, hitting every note with a confidence that captivated the crowd. But for Robert and his friends, this wasn't just about rap. This was about pride. And in the blink of an eye, that pride turned to humiliation. The sting of defeat was unbearable, and what started as a competition of skill spiraled into something much darker. What happened after that night will leave you questioning the extent to which the human ego can drive people to violence, and the lengths to which some will go to restore their shattered sense of self-worth. In the wake of her victory, Dominique would soon find herself facing an unimaginable nightmare. What transpired after that rap battle would change her life forever. Shot in the head, left for dead, and set on fire, Dominique's survival defied all odds, but her fight for survival would take everything she had. Her story is one of strength, resilience, and the fight to live against a backdrop of cruelty that no one should ever have to endure. This isn't just about a rap battle gone wrong. It's about what happens when egos collide, and how a moment of humiliation can spiral into violence, tragedy, and survival. This is a story that will make you question how far people will go when their pride is on the line, and how the smallest spark can ignite a nightmare no one could have predicted. The story begins in Columbus, Georgia, a town known for its southern charm, tight-knit community, and an undeniable sense of talent that pulses through its streets. On any given night, it wasn't unusual to find young people gathering at house parties, where music blared from speakers, and the air was thick with the energy of youth and ambition. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and it didn't take much to make a name for yourself. And when it came to rap, there was only one way to do that: through the fierce competition of a rap battle. This was no ordinary party. The crowd was amped, eager for the next big showdown. At the center of the action was the house itself, packed with people, each one trying to outshine the next. A few had already taken their turns at the mic, spitting rhymes that were either met with cheers or awkward silence. But the buzz wasn't about who went first. It was about who was going to take on the reigning champion, the one person everyone had been waiting for. That night, the circle would be graced by Dominique Clark, a rising star in the underground rap scene. But everyone knew her by another name, Nikki. A quick-witted, confident young woman, Nikki had earned a reputation for her lightning-fast delivery and razor-sharp punchlines. Her presence in the rap world was undeniable, and no one ever questioned whether she could hold her own. Whether she was facing men or women, Nikki had always been able to win battles with her commanding flow and the raw emotion that poured into every verse. As the night wore on, the energy in the house intensified. The music shifted to a heavier beat, a signal that the competition was about to get serious. The crowd shifted as a few eager faces surrounded the next battle's arena. Robert Johnson, known for his aggressive style and relentless competitive nature, stepped into the spotlight, eager to show off his skills. He was cocky, self-assured, and ready to prove his superiority. He had been the dominant force in Columbus for some time, his name synonymous with power and skill in the local rap scene. But that night, as he stepped up to the mic, he found himself facing a challenge he hadn't expected: Dominique. Nikki and Robert stood across from each other, the crowd buzzing in anticipation. The energy in the air was almost electric, and you could feel the tension rising as each person in the room waited for the first words to be exchanged. The stakes were high, more than just a rap battle. It was about dominance. It was about respect, reputation, and pride. Every rhyme was a chance to assert one's place in the hierarchy of the party, of the scene, of the community. As the beats dropped and the crowd fell silent, Nikki took her first turn. Her words were sharp, smooth, and effortless, a series of punches that hit Robert with precision. She showcased not only her lyrical skill but her ability to read the crowd, working them into a frenzy with every clever line. There was no hesitation in her delivery, no self-doubt. She was in complete control, and the crowd could feel it. Cheers erupted as Nikki fired off line after line, effortlessly outshining Robert's attempts to keep up. But Nikki wasn't just content to out-rap Robert with her words. She'd noticed something about him that she couldn't resist throwing into the mix. His ego, his swagger, everything about him reeked of someone who was too confident for his own good. As she finished her verse, she delivered one final line. "Before I end this verse, I must say something that sticks. You've been talking real big for a boy with a small dick." The room froze for a moment before it erupted into laughter. It was the kind of line that cut through the bravado like a knife, a jab at Robert's masculinity that left him stunned. His face went red as the crowd roared with laughter, some even clapping in appreciation of her perfect delivery. For Robert, this wasn't just about losing the battle. It was about being publicly humiliated in front of everyone, stripped of the image of power he had carefully built for himself. The sting of Nikki's words hit him harder than anything she had said in her verses. Robert, already struggling to maintain his composure after Nikki's previous lines, stood there, momentarily speechless. The humiliation of being laughed at in front of his peers was too much. His pride had been shattered in the most personal way possible, and as Nikki basked in the crowd's approval, Robert's sense of self-worth crumbled. As Nikki wrapped up her final verse, the crowd erupted in applause, fully aware of the outcome. She had dominated, leaving Robert defeated, his ego bruised, and his sense of self-worth shattered. But what the crowd didn't know, what no one in that room could predict, was how far Robert was willing to go to reclaim the respect he felt he had lost. What began as a competition of words and skill was about to turn into something much darker. The rest of the party carried on, but the mood had changed. The once lively atmosphere had shifted. While Nikki basked in the victory and the crowd continued to chant her name, Robert's mind was clouded with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't bear the idea of walking away from this night with his ego bruised, his masculinity questioned, and his friends witnessing his defeat. Robert wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. He had to prove a point that wasn't just about winning the battle anymore. It was about asserting dominance. It was about regaining the respect that he felt he had lost, and in his mind, the only way to do that was to take matters into his own hands. As the night dragged on, Robert and his crew huddled together, whispering among themselves. What had started as a fun and competitive rap battle was now fueling something darker inside Robert. His anger was festering, and the crowd's laughter, the applause for Nikki, only fueled it further. What started as a playful contest of words had transformed into a matter of pride, a matter of reclaiming what he had lost. But what Robert didn't realize, as he plotted his revenge, was how far he was willing to go to restore that lost respect. And in the heat of his humiliation, Robert began to entertain the unthinkable, the idea of not just winning the battle, but making sure that Nikki would never, ever outshine him again. The plot had already begun. The wheels were set in motion, and soon, Nikki would find herself trapped in a nightmare that no one could have predicted. The night was far from over. As the party continued in full swing, the adrenaline of the rap battle still pulsing through the crowd, the atmosphere shifted dramatically for a small group of people. Robert and his friends were no longer the carefree, competitive souls who had initially joined the rap battle. They were consumed by anger. Robert's ego had been shattered that night. He was used to being the center of attention, the one who could command respect through his lyrics, his presence, his bravado. But Nikki had defeated him. Her sharp wit and skill on the microphone had left him humiliated in front of his crew and the rest of the party. The crowd's admiration of her wasn't something Robert could easily shake off. In his mind, it wasn't just a game, it was a personal affront. To him, this was no longer about the music. It was about something deeper: his pride, his masculinity, and his need to reassert control. In the moments following the battle, Robert seethed with resentment. It wasn't enough for him to simply lose. He couldn't stand the thought of being publicly bested by a woman. The humiliation cut deeper than any of the harshest lyrics he'd faced that night, and as his anger festered, he began plotting. He shared his thoughts with his friends, those who had come with him and who had been watching him lose. The group became united in their rage, feeding off each other's fury, their focus narrowing on one goal: retaliation. Meanwhile, Nikki, unaware of the brewing storm around her, continued to enjoy the victory that had made her the center of attention. She had proven herself in a space that was often dominated by men. She wasn't just a participant, she was a force to be reckoned with. The crowd had recognized her talent, and she felt the rush of accomplishment. But as the night wound down, her attention began to drift toward heading home. She was exhausted but content, grateful for the sense of validation that came from being recognized by her peers. The adrenaline of the battle still lingered in the air as she left the house party, walking through the cool night air, unaware that her every move was being tracked. Robert and his friends had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, watching her leave. It wasn't long before they followed her down a quieter street. The world around them seemed unaware of the dark turn this night was about to take. The hum of distant music faded behind her, replaced by the rising tension in the air. Nikki's carefree walk soon became a grim procession. As she reached a more isolated part of town, far away from the party's safety, the group of men made their move. They called out to her, trying to get her attention. She turned, probably expecting one last exchange of words from the rap battle. But this time, the tone was different. Robert and his friends were no longer the laughing, joking figures from the party. They were angry, hostile, and they wanted to regain control. "What's up, Nikki?" Robert called, his voice tinged with bitterness. The others stood behind him, silent, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for the right moment to strike. At first, the conversation seemed like another verbal exchange. Maybe it was an apology, or perhaps they wanted to call her out again for her boldness in the battle. But Nikki quickly sensed the shift. There was no respect left in their voices, only a growing malice. "Why don't you say it to me again? In front of everyone, huh?" Robert spat, his words sharp and cutting. He stepped closer, his friends flanking him. The playful banter of a rap battle was gone, replaced with something far darker. Nikki's pulse quickened. She tried to step back, but the situation escalated too fast. The anger in Robert's eyes was unmistakable, and she knew she had to get away. But before she could react, one of the men grabbed her. She fought back, her instinct for survival kicking in. The scene that had once been filled with music, laughter, and joy now felt cold and hostile. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice trembling, but there was no one around to help. The few people who had been near the party had already gone inside, leaving her in the hands of these men, isolated and vulnerable. Robert and his friends were determined. With force and menace, they dragged her toward a nearby car. Nikki's heart raced, but she couldn't free herself. The situation had shifted from something verbal to something far more violent. As they threw her into the car, her world spun, the sounds of her own heartbeat drowning out everything else. The last thing she heard clearly was Robert's voice, his words cutting through the night like a blade. "You should have known better than to embarrass me." The car doors slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and Nikki was powerless to stop what was coming next. Inside the car, she struggled to free herself. Every twist and turn was met with rough hands. The men's anger had turned into something uncontrollable, and Nikki realized too late that this was no longer a confrontation. It was a kidnapping. They drove aimlessly for what felt like an eternity, the streets unfamiliar and dark. Nikki fought with every ounce of strength, but the overwhelming presence of her attackers proved too much. When the car finally stopped, they pulled her out and dragged her into an abandoned area, a desolate space far from any prying eyes, awaited her. What followed was a nightmare she couldn't have prepared for. Despite her cries, her pleas for help, the men were relentless. They did not see her as a human being. She was an object for their fury, their revenge. What they had failed to accomplish in the rap battle, they were trying to reclaim now, by stripping her of her dignity, her humanity, her very existence. Nikki fought back, physically and mentally, refusing to give in to the terror that was trying to consume her. She thought of her family, her friends, the life she had ahead of her, and she held on to those thoughts as tightly as she could. But in the end, no matter how hard she fought, they overpowered her. It all started with Robert. As his friends held both of her legs separated, he forced himself inside of her, laughing as she screamed in agony. She begged him, "Please stop." He immediately slapped her and said, "Is it still small? I bet it feels big now, doesn't it? You stupid bitch." She was crying, her body flinching as her body was being torn each time he violently forced him inside. And when he was finished, he spat on her and kicked her in her stomach. But it didn't stop there. His friends then decided to take turns raping her too. And just when it seemed that the brutality couldn't reach any further depths, Robert pulled out his gun, shot her in the head, and set her on fire. A final cruel act meant to leave no trace of who she was. The flames engulfed her, burning everything in their wake. She was left for dead. The attackers, believing they had destroyed everything about her body, her spirit, her future, drove away, certain that no one could survive what they had done. They thought they had silenced her forever. But what they didn't account for was Nikki's strength. She wasn't finished. Far from it. The fire, the pain, the suffering, it didn't end her. Nikki crawled. With every ounce of her remaining energy, she fought to survive, to escape. In the face of unimaginable violence, she pushed through, refusing to succumb to the death they had intended for her. Nikki Clark's story, filled with unimaginable horror and brutality, takes a powerful turn when it becomes a testament to sheer human resilience and survival. Shot in the head, burned and left for dead in the cold, dark night, Nikki's strength defied all expectations. What happened next would go down as a story of miraculous survival, one that would haunt her attackers, redefine her sense of self, and stand as a stark reminder of the will to live. Against all odds, Nikki didn't just lie there, waiting for death to claim her. Though her body was battered and broken, her spirit refused to surrender. The fire that had scorched her body raged, but Nikki fought to stay conscious. The unbearable pain of the flames licking at her skin, the blood pouring from her wounds, was enough to make anyone faint, to give up. But Nikki wasn't just anyone. She refused to let her attackers, those who had stolen her sense of security and dignity, be the last people to have any say in her fate. Her face, once full of confidence, was now unrecognizable, burned, swollen, and severely wounded. The blood from the gunshot wound to her head seeped into her hair, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. In those first moments, after they thought they had left her for dead, Nikki's fight for survival had already begun. She didn't stay on the ground. She forced herself to move. Every breath was excruciating. Every inch she crawled felt like a victory against the overwhelming weight of her injuries. The agony she endured would break most people, but not Nikki. She managed to roll over onto her stomach, pushing herself up with what little strength she had left. Her body screamed in pain, her vision blurred from the blood loss and shock. The flames still smoldered on parts of her body, the heat unbearable, but Nikki refused to stop. Her instincts kicked in. She had to survive. She had to make it out of that hell. With her hands, burned and bloody, she desperately tried to extinguish the flames. The smoldering remnants of fire on her clothing seemed to resist her efforts, but she wasn't willing to give in. Every movement was a battle. She had to put out the fire. If she didn't, it would consume her, and the pain would become unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, Nikki was able to put out the flames, but the toll it took on her body was far from over. At this point, Nikki's body was covered in blisters from the burns, and the gunshot wound in her head had left her weak. But somehow, she found the will to continue crawling, inching toward freedom. It wasn't about revenge or getting back at her attackers. It was about survival. It was about proving that they hadn't won, that they couldn't take away everything from her. The physical strain of crawling through the dirt, the road, and the grass made each moment feel like a year. The blood stained the earth beneath her as she fought to maintain consciousness. Her mind was foggy, the cold seeping deeper into her bones. Every inch she crawled felt like a monumental step toward survival, but there were moments when her body wanted to give in. But Nikki held on. She knew she couldn't stop. She knew she couldn't let the darkness overtake her. If she did, they would win. She refused to let that happen. It wasn't until she finally reached the side of a road that Nikki found her salvation. Crawling for what must have been hours, she spotted the faint headlights of a car approaching. It was a passerby, someone who had no idea the horror Nikki had just lived through. With the last of her strength, Nikki raised her arm, waving frantically in an effort to stop the car. The driver, startled by the sight of a woman in such distress, quickly pulled over and rushed to her side. Nikki, barely conscious and covered in blood and burns, managed to say just enough to indicate that she needed help. She had been attacked, left for dead. The passerby immediately called 911, and within moments, emergency services were on the scene. By the time the ambulance arrived, Nikki was barely conscious, her body struggling to stay alive. She had crawled through what felt like an eternity of agony, but somehow she had made it to safety. Her journey was far from over, but the first step had been taken. The darkness she had crawled through was finally giving way to the bright lights of hope. The paramedics rushed to her side, providing medical attention to her multiple life-threatening injuries. The gunshot wound in her head was severe, but the bullet had miraculously missed any critical areas, leaving her with a fighting chance. Her body was covered in burns, but they could be treated. It was a miracle she had survived the attack at all, let alone managed to crawl to safety. As she was rushed to the hospital, Nikki's story was just beginning. The brutal attack she had endured would soon become a headline, and the world would learn of her incredible survival. But for now, Nikki was focused on healing. Every step she took in the hospital was a victory, a symbol of the strength that she had found in herself, even when her attackers thought they had taken everything from her. Nikki's fight for survival was not only a fight for her physical body, but also for her spirit. She had been pushed to the brink of death, but she had refused to let the horrors of that night define her. She had survived because she chose to, because the human will to live is stronger than the forces that seek to destroy us. And now, as she lay in a hospital bed, the world would watch as she began the long road to recovery. Her journey was far from over, but Nikki had proven something to herself and to everyone who would come to hear her story. No matter the odds, no matter the brutality, survival is possible. Her strength, her will to live, her resilience, those were the true marks of her victory. Nikki's miraculous survival was just the beginning of an arduous journey that would challenge her physically, mentally, and emotionally. As she regained consciousness in the hospital, the full scope of the brutality she had experienced began to settle into her awareness. The medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but Nikki's injuries were severe. Her head wound, though not immediately fatal, required complex surgery to address the damage. The burns, deep and extensive, covered large portions of her body, requiring painstaking treatment and ongoing care. The emotional toll was just as significant as the physical. Nikki was not just recovering from a horrific attack. She was coming to terms with the betrayal, violence, and violation that had been inflicted on her. The recovery process was grueling. Nikki faced long days of surgeries and physical therapy. The burns on her body would require years to heal, and even then, they would leave permanent scars, reminders of the night that nearly took her life. The trauma was psychological as well as physical. Nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety would accompany her every day. The strength she had shown in crawling to safety and fighting for her life was now called upon again, as she had to summon the courage to face the investigation, the courtroom, and the painful process of reliving the attack. But Nikki, despite her own suffering, knew that she had a duty to face the men who had almost killed her. She knew that her courage could make the difference in ensuring they would never harm anyone again. Her resolve was unshakable. She would tell the truth, even if it meant confronting the memories of the most horrifying moments of her life. As Nikki's physical wounds slowly began to heal, the investigation into the attack moved forward. Detectives scoured the scene for evidence and conducted interviews with anyone who could provide information about the night of the crime. The case quickly drew attention, partly because of the sheer brutality involved, but also because of Nikki's incredible survival. Her testimony would become the key to bringing the perpetrators to justice. When she was able to speak, Nikki bravely gave a detailed account of the events that had unfolded that night. She described the rap battle, the escalating tension between her and Robert, and the humiliation that had driven him to seek violent revenge. She told authorities about how she had been lured away from the party, forced into the car, and how her attackers had taken turns assaulting her before attempting to end her life. Despite the physical and emotional pain, Nikki's determination to bring the men to justice never wavered. Her statement helped police identify Robert, Katori Glover, and Joey Guerin as the three primary suspects. Investigators found additional evidence tying them to the crime, including security footage from the area and witness testimony from people who had seen the men near the scene. The authorities acted quickly, arresting the three men, all of whom initially denied any involvement. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. It wasn't just Nikki's testimony, it was the physical evidence, the forensics, and the eyewitness accounts that painted a damning picture. As the trial began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Nikki, having made the difficult decision to testify, took the stand and recounted the nightmare she had survived. Her voice, though shaky at times, carried the weight of her experience. Her words left no room for doubt. These men were responsible for what had happened to her. The defense tried to discredit her, casting doubt on her version of events, but the jury could see the pain in her eyes and the courage in her heart. Nikki's bravery in recounting the details of the crime became the foundation for the case against the three men. The prosecution presented a strong case. They laid out the evidence: the gunshot wound, the burns, the forensic analysis that confirmed the presence of the three men at the scene. They showed how the attackers had tried to cover their tracks, but their actions had been too reckless, too violent. The defense, despite their efforts to argue that the incident had been a random act of violence, couldn't refute the fact that the crime had been fueled by a brutal sense of wounded pride. Robert, Katori, and Joey had been motivated by a bruised ego after losing a rap battle, a petty, prideful reason for such monstrous actions. After a tense trial that lasted several weeks, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict. Robert Johnson, Katori Glover, and Joey Guerin were all found guilty of the brutal assault, rape, shooting, and attempted murder of Nikki Clark. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict, and Nikki, though still recovering physically and emotionally, felt a sense of relief wash over her. For all the pain she had endured, this moment was a small victory. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally intense. The judge listened to emotional statements from Nikki's family and friends, who spoke about the lasting impact the attack had had on their lives. They expressed how Nikki's resilience had inspired them all to become stronger in the face of adversity. The men, who had shown no remorse throughout the trial, were given their sentences. Robert Johnson, Katori Glover, and Joey Guerin were each sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Nikki, this was a measure of justice, though it couldn't undo the trauma she had experienced. The three men would never walk free again, but Nikki's recovery would take years. Still, the conviction meant that they would never be able to hurt anyone else. She had made sure of that. But the real battle for Nikki wasn't just about seeing her attackers behind bars, it was about her own healing process. The emotional and psychological scars of that night would take much longer to heal than the physical wounds. The recovery process, while ongoing, involved not only therapy and counseling, but also reclaiming her life and sense of self. Nikki had become a symbol of resilience, but she also had to learn how to live with the memories of what had happened to her and how to rebuild herself in the wake of such devastation. As she moved forward, Nikki found strength in the support of her family and friends. She took on the challenge of healing, one day at a time. The community rallied around her, offering their love and encouragement. While the men responsible for her suffering would never be able to hurt her again, Nikki's fight to regain a sense of normalcy and peace was just beginning. The case of Nikki Clark, though horrific, served as a reminder of the power of the human spirit to survive even the most brutal attacks. It also highlighted the importance of standing up against violence and the necessity of justice for survivors. While the three men who had committed the crime would live out their lives behind bars, Nikki would go on to live hers, her strength and courage, inspiring all who heard her story. As we wrap up today's harrowing story, it's impossible not to reflect on the sheer magnitude of what Dominique Nikki Clark endured. Her strength, her resilience in the face of the unimaginable, it's a testament to the power of the human spirit. What would any of us do in the face of such brutality? Would we have the courage to survive, to keep fighting when it seems like all hope is lost? Nikki's survival is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, we can find the strength to keep moving forward. But Nikki's journey didn't end with her miraculous survival. It took everything she had to bring her attackers to justice, to stand in that courtroom and testify against the men who had tried to take her life. And while the physical scars may eventually fade, the emotional and psychological wounds are far deeper. Her courage to share her story and the lengths she went to fight for justice have inspired countless others and serve as a reminder that survival is not just about enduring, but about reclaiming your power in the aftermath. If you found Nikki's story as powerful and moving as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories of survival, justice, and the shocking truths behind the crimes that shape our world. There are countless stories out there, each one with a lesson, a call to action, or a powerful moment of redemption. Who knows what we'll uncover next? Each new case brings with it the promise of something unexpected, something that will leave us questioning the world around us. And now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Nikki's shoes? Would you have found the strength to survive? Would you have been able to face the courtroom and tell your story? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and sharing your perspective can help create a community of strength, empathy, and shared understanding. Let's keep this conversation going as we continue to uncover the stories that remind us all of the resilience that lies within us. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never underestimate the power of survival.